Okay, good. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to share some real estate at this very interesting workshop. I'm still something of a cub in this business, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking in front of people whose work has influenced mine on so many levels, and I'll mention some in the foregoing. I'm going to do two things in the time I have for you this morning. What I've given you to read is a chapter from my forthcoming book. It's supposed to come out in August with Oxford, titled Recovering International Relations, The Promise of Sustainable Critique. And in it, I address what I call the realist dilemma and its encounter with the limits of theory. My fear, though, is that the chapter will seem a great deal harsher than I intend it to be, because the context of the arguments, the critiques that I'm trying to make, isn't there. So what I'm going to try to do very quickly is give you first a sense of what sustainable critique is, sort of 5 or 7 minute overview of the project. So I have to apologize to Tim, who in addition now to having gotten up at 5 in the morning, must hear this twice because he's heard this before. But I will give you a very quick kind of 5 minute overview of this project, and then relate that to the paper you have in front of you, and I think the issues we're trying to address. Are you all hearing me okay?
Yeah, very good. Very good.
All right. So the book is essentially an extended call for what I'm calling sustainable critique. Let me quickly walk you through the bare bones of what I mean by that, what I'm calling for it, and how I mean to do it. By sustainable critique, I mean an approach to international relations theory in which there is a sustained balance between theorizing of practical knowledge-building variety and theory of a critical reflexive variety. By practical theory, I mean bodies of social science theory in which methods are leveraged in order to create useful knowledge about the world. Such theory seeks the intelligent manipulation of human and natural forces in the service of values and methodologies to that end. Oh, I've just lost my page. To that end. By critical or reflexive theory, I mean bodies of theory and connections between fact, values, or problematized. The desire to remake the world, as Habermas tells us in Knowledge and Interests, reflects the kind of a priori passion for it, pre-existing knowledge, pre-existing values for understanding or improving it. Practical knowledge is created in the shadow of such values. Whether that passion is rooted in idle curiosity or full-bore messianism, whether we are tinkerers and experimenters, if you like, or would-be revolutionaries, our passion, the quality of it, is not a neutral act in our inquiry. How we deal with that is awareness of those animating values, even when we are in the guts of complex problems, in the heat of activity, or the stress of real is the primary problem facing sustainably critical IR theory. In the book, I call this thus that emerges from this, the animus vitandi, the will to dwell within or to abide within a complex, in the world, that is, and not in our thoughts. And as you've already guessed, this is in homage to Hans Morgenthau's animus dominandi, the will to dominate, which he said is the basic factor of international politics. For its part, vitandi reflects a basic reality of theory applied to politics, our new trend we have to create. Should I carry on?
Yeah.
Okay. So most of what we associate with contemporary bodies of IR theory is practical, from the design of workable international institutions, to the study of nuclear deterrence, to the study of how norms emerge in the international community, to studies of human security, or studies of how gender and identity are used to create or manipulate consensus. There is, then, I mean to suggest, a lopsided quality to developments in international relations. It's not that IR scholars have ignored the need for critique. On the contrary, recognition of its necessity has been present since the beginnings of the discipline. But there's been no systematic approach to building critical perspectives to compare with the efforts given to practical theory. Practical theory moves from strength to strength. Critique emerges post facto as a kind of intuitive afterthought. Because of this, theories have a tendency to become reified, to become naturalized, such that they, and the concepts upon which they are predicated, become conflated with things in themselves. For Adorno, this is the essential problem of concepts and remembering their non-identity with objects. For Gerrit Lukács, this is the problem of phantom objectivity. For Axel Honneth and Berger and Luckmann, reification is the problem of forgetting the ways in which ideas mix into the material world and remake it, and by extension, forgetting our responsibility in creating the world we have. As those who think for a living, we have a special role in how the world comes into being. Reification leads us to forget this. We come to believe that we are simply studying an already extant world in detached empirical terms, as it happens contingently to play upon our senses. We are freed from taking responsibility for that world or for the things we say about it. Now, IR theory, as we know, emerged in an era in which human violence had transformed itself dramatically. It emerged emerged in the shadow of universal, world-destroying violence, and as a response to it, the attempt to control or contain it by developing accounts of its nature, its productive use, or its limitations. How we do that varies based on what we think that violence is, the stuff we think the world is made of, and the interaction between the two. But that attempt is something we all have in common. And in that sense, IR can be said to be united under a common sense of vocation, that we disagree profoundly and at times commensurately as to how to operationalize that vocation doesn't mean that it isn't broadly shared, from Richard Ashley to Cohane, from Morgenthau to Carl Deutsch to David Lake to Tarek Barkawi, and I'm using these names because these are people who've specifically written on IR as a vocation. For IR to sustain its vocation, that I would suggest, given the problem of reification and the problem of near immediate universal violence, it must learn to sustain both reason and critique in the same intellectual moment. What I aim to do in the book is show how that might be done and how the need for it has been broadly understood across the discipline, even if it's never been actually achieved. I do this through very broad case studies across 7 decades of IR theorizing. Different chapters take up different traditions of that thinking, realist, liberal, critical, and so forth. But the overall argument is the same. Actually sustaining the needed balance between practical and critical theory is proven elusive. What you have here is one of those case studies, the one dealing with realism. In the remainder of the book, I then develop an approach for this kind of sustainable critique, drawing on Adorno's notion of constellation from his negative dialectics. Okay, so much for a broad kind of overview into the project. Let me very quickly now try to summarize, with the time I've got left, the key arguments in this chapter. And my discussion of it is going to be more Morgenthau-centric than the chapter itself is, but I'll be glad to answer or talk about the rest of the chapter in Q&A if you'd like. I think the Morgenthau part is the most interesting for us, for all the reasons that Tim mentions, right? Because he's invited to critical theorists for a certain kind of way. If I were to summarize the chapter I have in front of you in terms of what's interesting for this workshop and its aims, I guess what I'd want to say is this. It's really quite understandable when you look at how international theory emerged after the third debate, why theorists like Ned Lebow or Michael Williams, or on the other hand, Fareed Zakaria, Aaron Friedberg, Randall Schweller, would be getting excited about Morgenthau. He is indeed a fantastically interesting thinker, and his work gestures to a lot of problems of interest to post-third or fourth debate IR scholars, whether rationalist or reflectivist, if we're going to use Robert Cohane's somewhat tired dichotomy. The problem is that Morgenthau, the theorist, doesn't necessarily solve the problems that Morgenthau, the thinker, sees so clearly. He doesn't deliver in ways which are subtle and hard to get at. There is a disconnect between the theorist as passionate observer, if you like, and the theorist as promulgator of something like a systematic account of the world. Texts like Morgenthau's Death in the Nuclear Age, or Science, Servant or Master, as well as his essays on love and the like, all crackle with a kind of passionate critical unease, a familiar gnawing concern that thinking isn't quite what it's cracked up to be, that it's not up to the challenges of modernity. Yet if Morgenthau proceeds from this problem, and if he's animated by it, it's also clear that he's not entirely persuasive in how he characterizes it, or what he attempts to do about it. If we highlight what he sought to do, we also ought to think about what he failed to do, chose not to do, and how those failures or choices continue to reverberate in the discipline. From there, we might get some sense of what we might do. Now, borrowing Vasilis Kopais's apt phrase, it's not that I intend to award or withhold credentials of criticality in my consideration of Morgenthau's work, or that of successor students in realism. Rather, I wish to explore the possibility of a particular set of intellectual moves to illuminate and address in theory the problem that both students of IR and of for critical theory have identified under the broad heading of the ongoing crisis in late modernity. In a nutshell, for someone as concerned with the limitations of thinking and its dialectically regressive potential as Morgenthau seems to be, his actual account of what thinking is remarkably conservative. It seems to reproduce the same reduced horizons, the same reified closure that he so decries. It is this disconnect and its consequences which the chapter considers, its substance and its effects for the field. Now let me rush in and make a quick clarification. When I say that I think Morgenthau's thinking is conservative, I don't mean to deny that Morgenthau was politically radical, that he engaged in a kind of radical dissidence, right, on issues from race to war. Morgenthau pushed strongly for such dissidence, and as Rush's paper reminds us, he paid something of a price for doing that. But one can be, as Walter Benjamin once said of Karl Kraus, intellectually conservative, even if one is also politically radical. And it's that intellectual conservatism the chapter wants to think through. Thinking on Morgenthau's account, can you all still hear me? Yes. Okay. Thinking on Morgenthau's account does not seem to change much. It sets lived experience against age-old truths with an eye to synthesizing practical knowledge, It's a sophisticated and rich account of such thinking, one which I think corresponds more or less well to how social scientists think they think, using concepts drawn from past events, modes, orders, or forms, whether or not their generative contexts and genealogies are apparent to us, or not, to make sense of observed realities. Certainly theorists of IR, from Ernst Haas to Carl Deutsch, to David Mitrani, to Alex Wendt would feel at home here, and I think now that I've read Adam Humphrey's very interesting and persuasive paper, I think Ken Waltz would be at home with that too. But here's the key point. Isn't this image of thought precisely what's got us into so much trouble? As Tim's paper reminds us, the dialectic of enlightenment and reason and revolution means to suggest something very particular. Not that practical theory does nothing good or emancipatory, but rather that its emancipatory and regressive elements are sort of a piece. If one were to sum up, speaking very broadly, the critical turn that was made after the Second World War, would it not be to, as Adorno puts it in the negative dialectics, to rearrange one's thinking so that things like Auschwitz and Hiroshima don't happen anymore? Rearranging one's thinking isn't the same thing as doing different things within the same image of thinking, or at least that's what I take them to mean. Using Viv and Michael's fascinating paper on realism as rhetorical practice can help me illustrate what I mean here. For Adorno and the post-war critical theorists, such a rearranged rhetoric would need to argue in a way that negates itself in the process of negating the facile claims of others. When philosophers engage in argument, Adorno tells us in the Minima Moralia, they should attempt to lose the argument in such a way as to convict their interlocutors of untruth. How you do that, while also taking on the immediate tasks of defeating Nixon, getting us out of Vietnam, or countering the claims of nuclear hawks like Herman Kahn, well, that's rather difficult to do, to be fair, but hic Rhodus hic saltus, as Hegel put it, that's the jump you need to make. That's the point of departure. If you would jump to Rhodes, jump from there. Right. The reason we critical theory types get so hot and bothered, I think, about scientific man and power politics is that it seems to echo themes that remind us of this. But rearranging thinking isn't really what Adorno does, nor it seems to me is it something which Adorno's thinking admits the possibility of. Indeed, Morgenthau sort of does the opposite. He insists on the timelessness of thinking, both its form and its basic structures and categories. Hence, he tells us in Politics Among Nations, we can look over the shoulder of Bismarck. If we see what he saw, we'll think what he thought. Hence, he tells us in his lectures on Thucydides, there are really no new problems in politics, only new circumstances. So if we want to understand class conflict or race conflict or the balance of power, we should study ancient Greece or Cotilia. Or think of what he says in his fragment of intellectual autobiography, the thinking mind conscious of itself and of others, right? That's the constant that he sees across time. Now, at the same time that he's doing that, he's also calling for a world state. Now, theoretically, a world state means that something is going to change in politics rather fundamentally and for the first time. It will be a wholly new form of political experience, one in which there is no inside-outside distinction anymore, or else that inside-outside distinction is going to change radically in form. If so, it's simply not clear how we are to think about it, or even how we would think within it, how our traditions of politics will have to change, or even what thinking in that context would come to mean, because of their thinking partnership in this, to the gesture to the excellent Arendt Morgenthau paper that was given, I think, yesterday. I cite Arendt's notion of natality to give you a sense of how you might try, her attempt to think what we're doing, and to develop the kinds of friendships and alliances one would need in order to do that thinking, right? So Arendt talks about the miracle that saves the world, right? And she talks about this Greek notion that the world is going to run to its normal natural ruin, and she says, well, the miracle that Christianity gives us is that something wholly new might be born from outside us, right? That's what the gospel gives us, right? That's what natality is, right? And Morgenthau doesn't really take anything like that up, at least as far as I can see. He calls on it. He calls on us to do it in works like Death in the Nuclear Age, right? He tells us that if we don't fix the mismatch between the way we think and the reality in which we're thinking, we're all going to die. But telling us we've got to do that isn't the same as thinking that new way of thinking into being. That hortatory quality, the hortatory quality that arises from that mismatch, because he winds up railing against the declining public sphere and heaping heroic expectations on scholars to fight its growing irrationalism and sterility, is, I think, what leaves him open to the critiques of Waltz and makes Waltz's distinction in 1959 between realist thought and neo-realist theory so inviting to some of these scholars. And I think, too, it's the reason that Wendt will want so badly to remain within the positivist camp, even as he re-engages in idealist international theory. He wants the problem of world politics to be a problem of steering, as he tells us in 2001, rather than a problem of mutually incompatible theories of political action predicated on exclusive political ontologies. Morgenthau has glimpsed an even thinking, but it goes unanswered, and to follow him there is to follow him into a cul-de-sac, and none of us want to go there. In short, if part of what we're here to do is to reorient realism, whether in the singular or the plural, realism or realisms, it seems in ways, I should say, that move us past behaviorist reduction and reawaken us to its critical capacity. It seems to me, that we need to do more than engage in sociological or historical analyses of the conditions and constraints in which that thought emerges, although that's important. And it means doing more than acknowledging the radical incommensurability that scientific realists like Colin White and Heikki Potomaki have so successfully driven home, even though that's important. And I think it's to do more than accept a tragic sense of our own finitude, as Ned Levine rightly commends us all to do. We must do all that. But we must do it even as thinking must learn to deal with the problem of reification, to chasten it from within, and to renegotiate the relationship between the concepts it uses and the things those concepts would describe. If we fail to do that, we risk, I think, going back down that same cul-de-sac. That, in the chapter, is the role that Randall Schweller plays for me, right? I'm going to use Randall Schweller as a kind of potted case study for what happens if you do an unreconstructed Morgenthau. And what does Schweller do? Well, he takes Carl Schmitt and doesn't use him as someone who's made a smart analysis of the problem of Weimar-era liberal democracy, but rather uses him as someone making prescriptions for our own day and age, calling on the state to reoccupy the public sphere because it's become too fractious, because it's been rendered too fractious by the people and their cross-cutting economic interests and their willingness to sacrifice collective goods for personal interests. Now, Schweller lacks Morgenthau's keen philosophical sensibility. He lacks his intuitive understanding of power and cruelty. And I think because of that, he's able to make these kinds of mistakes, but I think that Morgenthau is kind of the one that's pointing him there. To reorient realism, then, it seems to me, is to figure out a way to think your way out of that cul-de-sac, to design approaches to scholarship and methods equal to the challenge it poses. So I think that's enough for now, and we'll let the Q&A suss out the rest. If you can also